So today we tackle the hot topic of superannuation and separation. So welcome again, Geoff. And I'll be completely honest here, mate. I had no idea that superannuation was part of a separation, or it could be split as part of separation or divorce. Can you let us know why it's so important?
Well, let's take a bit of a backwards dive. I think superannuation has grown enormously. I'll give you some background. So, those of us who are a little bit older might realise that superannuation as a compulsory contribution by your employer didn't start until the early 1990s. And it's now grown to where I think we're at about 11.5% of your salary is now paid as super from 1 July this year. And ultimately, 12% will be of your earnings will be paid to you as superannuation. So it's grown enormously into a multi-billion-dollar valuation exercise by ordinary Australians over the last 30 or so years. Also, interestingly, and with superannuation, you couldn't divide it until 2003 when the legislation was changed, and it actually allows it to be divided, or we call it split, or superannuation splitting.
So can you explain to us, for people wanting to split their super, what the first step would be for them to do that? Where do they start?
Well, the first thing is knowing how much superannuation you have. So that might seem simple, but it's not always the case. We would probably, in a number of situations, have one spouse who simply doesn't know how much super the other party has. So finding out how much super that mum and or dad have is pretty important.
So how do you do that? Like I wouldn't know how much super I would have. So what advice, or where can people go to find out how much superannuation they have?
You can sort of work backwards. So let's start with the simplest processes. Firstly, you can see if anyone's received a superannuation statement in the mail or electronically. So if you've got Plum Superannuation, they will normally have an account and they'll send you some balances up 30th June or the 31st of December, or they may have an electronic account so that if you can have access to that, you can find out how much superannuation there is. That's the first step. A second way to actually undertake a superannuation inquiry is to do a formal application to the super fund to ask for someone's super balance at a certain point in time, and that whether that was at separation or you're trying to get an up-to-date balance now so that you can work out how you divide it.
So there are so many superannuation funds out there and available. Are there any funds that are off limits that can't be divided?
Well, there's two that I can think of immediately, and they're still fairly in a narrow band. So most people have what they call an accumulation account. So in other words, if I am working for Rock Concrete and they pay me $100,000 a year, and 10,000 of that then goes paid on top as my superannuation. That $10,000 a year earns interest when it gets invested by the super fund, and over 10 years it might build up to be $150,000. That's called an accumulation account. Now, interestingly, under a few different systems, particularly the federal government employees had what we call defined benefits, which is a curious formula that basically works out how much superannuation you have based on how many years you work for them and how much your salary is. So they do it as a multiple of salary. So if when you retire you were earning $100,000 a year, as I mentioned before, they might multiply that by 4.7 and you have $470,000 worth of superannuation. So some of those defined benefit accounts, because they don't actually have the cash in them, can't be split as such or divided as a lump sum cash component into someone else's super account. The other one, what we deal with, is called self-managed super funds. So probably over 90% of Australians don't have a self-managed fund, but some people do, particularly those with somewhat larger balances and those who want to manage their own superannuation. Now, why can't you divide a self-managed super fund? In some cases you can, but it depends on what the self-managed fund owns. So if the fund, for example, owns a house or an investment unit or a commercial property, you can't physically take the cash out of one party's share of that commercial property and simply transfer it to some other super fund, because you can't sell the underlying asset. So you have to then go and look at, well, what can we do in those circumstances before we divide any super to actually wind out the assets that the super fund might have?
Right. So superannuation that can be divided. What are the options when it comes to a property settlement?
So there are a few. For example, you may not want to divide the superannuation at all. So in the case of, again, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, we'll say if Mr. Brown has $200,000 worth of super, but they own a house worth $200,000, they may elect for one person to keep the house and the other person to keep their superannuation intact.
Ah, so you can do that.
Yes. So it's a juggling act between dividing all of the assets, i.e. a house or cars or other cash, and adding the superannuation into the pile to then work out, if you're dividing things on an equal percentage, who keeps which of those assets. And sometimes that involves shifting some of the superannuation, sometimes that involves shifting a larger chunk.
Okay, so you don't have to divide just the super equally. There can be other assets that come into play.
Absolutely, and I think identifying those assets and working out broadly what you want to do with them is just as important as dividing up the superannuation.
Has there been times where an equal division with super hasn't occurred?
Look, there's lots of occasions where that occurs, but there's three really obvious ones that I can think of that come up quite frequently. So, for example, in a short relationship. So if Mr. and Mrs. Brown, in my example, were only together for a couple of years, but Mr. Brown had built up $1 million worth of super over his 30 years previously, it may not be fair that half of his super be given to Mrs. Brown in those circumstances, because it wasn't a contribution of the relationship. So he might retain the bulk of his superannuation in those circumstances. Conversely, in short relationships, so you're a relatively young couple, you don't have any children yet, you separate and you've got a couple of cars and your superannuation balances might only be in the tens of thousands. Both parties may elect to then effectively keep whatever super they built up together. So they're two pretty good examples. The third one is simply where the parties want to, as I previously mentioned, divide things in a different way. So if one party, for example, is very close to retirement age, they may want to retain that superannuation so that if they've turned 65, they can then cash it out rather than give it to the other part of it to the other spouse who may not be able to access it as cash for years and years. So they're three really good examples of why super isn't divided equally on every occasion.
Yep. So we always finish these chats with a bit of a feel-good topic. So do you have any tips that you can share with someone going through separation to help them feel super again? Pardon the pun.
Well, you've always got plenty of puns, Dane, but look, I think feeling super is about your energy levels, and I think there's probably three things that sort of come to mind about that. One is, do you get enough sleep? That's the fundamental bedrock of good energy, is sleeping well, sleeping with a regular routine, getting enough hours of sleep. So, there's lots of good science. You can listen to lots of podcasts about how much sleep you need. But for most people, it's about 7 to 8 hours. And if you go to bed at a regular time and get up at a regular time, you'll probably feel a lot better. The second one is, I think, is movement. Again, I touched on that a couple of podcasts ago, but exercise and getting out in the fresh air and doing things is super critical. So getting good sleep and basically looking after yourself, good nutrition as well. So if you eat well, sleep well, move well, I think you're a pretty good chance of feeling super. And then, as I've said, getting your mental health right as well, in terms of being able to deal with the right people who are good for you, providing energy to you rather than taking it away. We don't use that phrase, energy vampires. Sometimes we want to associate with people who give you energy and not just take it away. So there's some good ways to feel super, I think.
Too true. Great advice. Thanks again, Geoff, for your informative chat and information, particularly around superannuation. I'm sure there's a lot of people that were not aware of how all of that worked. So thanks again for the chat. Before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to finish up on?
Oh, look, I just think superannuation is a complex beast, and it's important that even you get some preliminary advice before you work out what you're going to do with it, because if you get the right advice early, you can come up with a sensible outcome without too much complexity.
Yeah, very good. Thanks again, Geoff. We'll catch up again soon.
Pleasure. Thanks for being part of the podcast.